Hello and welcome to our Enhancement conference. I'm Ailsa Crum from QAA and will shortly hand over to Professor Alison Tobin. It's a good morning here in Glasgow, but I'm conscious that we are going to be joined over the next 2 days from over 430 delegates from 20 different countries, and you will all be in your own time zones. We always like to make you feel welcome when you come to one of our events, and today and tomorrow we are taking that to the next level. So we're inviting you to join us from the comfort of your own homes, and we hope that you'll enjoy the fantastic programme that we have here. We really do have a very exciting set of sessions for you over the next 2 days, both on and offline. This morning we will hear from Professor Mary Stuart about the 21st Century Lab project that she has been leading at the University of Lincoln. There'll be lots of opportunity for you to engage with us, and if you have logged on early, then you will have seen the starter screens with information about how to use the chat and the question functions. Please do make use of those, and we would like the session to be as interactive as possible. You can also join us on social media, and you can see on the holder slides that we're using the hashtag. It's hashtag ETConf20, but you'll see that on all of the template slides. So do join us there. Also have a look out for our supporting resources. We have lots of resources being launched over the course of the next 2 days. So do keep checking back, even if you're not able to join us live for all of the individual sessions. Okay, so if we're all sitting comfortably at this time of disruption, then let's explore together what really counts in higher education. And I will hand over to Professor Alison Tobin. Thank you.
So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this virtual conference. Before I start, I'd just like to thank the QAA Scotland team for getting all of this together. I know what a challenging time it is when you can't see people face to face. So I'm sure you're starting to relax now to know that your first speaker has at least shown myself on the screen to everybody. So welcome to this virtual conference, virtual space. It would have been very nice to have been welcoming everybody in person, particularly as this was a major event that was planned to showcase all the work that has been going on over the last 3 years on the enhancement themes. But all being well, we'll be ready to greet you in person in the autumn. In the meantime, my task is to give you a brief introduction to the enhancement themes, what they are, how they run, and what they mean to Scottish higher education. And I'm aware that I'm speaking to a mixed audience here. Some of you I know have been very active on the themes, not just the current one, but many over the last 10 or so years. And some of you joining us today may be completely brand new to the themes, but hopefully there's something for all of you in the next few minutes of my welcome. So first of all, the Scottish enhancement themes I consider a real strength to higher education in Scotland. They're managed by QAA Scotland on behalf of the higher education sector, and they form part of the quality enhancement framework. The overriding aim of the themes is to enhance the learning experience of students studying in the Scottish higher education sector. So how do they work? Well, the first step is for the sector to get together and identify and then eventually agree a specific area to work on, and that's the theme. And they generally run for 3 years. Once the theme's been identified, it's organised in a way that encourages institutions across Scotland, staff and students to work together to develop new ideas and models for innovating learning and teaching. So each theme is chosen carefully to allow the sector to share, learn from current and innovative national and international practice. And it was great seeing the chat comments coming through as we were preparing to start the conference, to see that we're being joined by people all over the world. And I hope it's not too early in the morning for some of you to be, or late at night indeed, to be joining us. So collaboration is the key to the success of the enhancement themes in Scotland, and it is a real strength, the way that we work together across the sector and we're prepared to share things and learn from each other. And I have to say that at the moment, in these particularly challenging times, this collaborative approach is what's keeping many of us going and also able to support our staff and encourage our staff as well. So the current enhancement theme is called Evidence for Enhancement, Improving the Student Experience. It was launched in October 2017. And as I said, it's reached its 3 years when we would normally be concluding the theme and reporting. It's allowed us to reflect on data available within the Scottish sector and how we use it to understand what we do well and what we might improve upon. Through the work of the current theme, we aimed to identify issues that might benefit from intervention. We then looked to prioritise those interventions for improving the student experience. And a key component this time is the evaluation. Have these interventions been effective? Can we report on the ways that the student experience is improving? So what's driven the topics within this theme is evidence. How do we navigate it? How do we use it? And how do we know whether it's being effective? The current theme has been working across all 19 Scottish higher education institutions, working together. Each one formulates an annual plan, which is then used to guide colleagues through the work. And the work is chosen by individual universities to link it very much into their own institutional strategic priorities. There's collaborative sharing, but there's also local prioritisation of topics to suit individual institutions. As well as the overarching theme within it, we formed 8 collaborative clusters where groups of institutions work together on a topic that will benefit the whole sector. And the collaborative clusters have included evidence used in the creative disciplines, a project on beyond the metrics, the intangibles, employability and graduate support, online delivery. That was a useful one, thought up 3 years ago, that we're very much benefiting from now. Students' experience of community, student mental well-being, widening participation with lecture recording, and learning analytics. So you can see from those 8 clusters that the activities and the material coming out from those topics is incredibly useful, particularly in these times of moving to online delivery. In addition to those clusters, sector work was taken across 3 strands: optimising existing evidence, defining and capturing evidence, and student engagement and demographics. Within the optimising existing evidence strand, we explored evidence and data for enhancement, focused on upskilling of staff and students to be able to engage with evidence, and ultimately aim to increase skills and knowledge in data and evidence use. Under defining and capturing evidence, we've been working with a group of Scottish higher education planners to better understand the data we commonly use across the sector. And the planners have developed a really valuable higher education data landscape resource, which helps us navigate around common data sets and their relationship to key quality activities. And that's a very important piece of work, because often the challenge is not simply accessing data, it's finding our way through what is becoming an increasingly large volume of data that's available to us. So navigating through that data and the guide that's been available to us has been incredibly useful. And the third strand on student engagement and demographics has involved listening and understanding student perspectives. And that's been central to the theme activity, bringing the students in, responding to student voice, and using evidence to deliver student projects. A number of those have been led by students largely within students' associations as a collaborative project across the sector. So today's conference is being offered to the higher education sector as a response to the current environment. The topic, as Ailsa said, is learning from disruption, exploring what counts in higher education. And it draws on our use of research, data, and evidence to support staff and students in these very unprecedented times. It's replacing our planned 2-day face-to-face conference, where we would have celebrated the achievements of the current theme. And as I said, we do plan to reschedule that event later on, hopefully in the autumn. Over the next 2 days, we've brought together colleagues from Scotland, rest of the UK and internationally to share thoughts and experiences. And it appears that we have 300 delegates registered for the next 2 days events. And I'm particularly delighted to be joined by students. Many of you I know are new sabbatical officers, either just taken up your position or about to start. Again, it would have been so nice to have welcomed you in person, but I'm sure we'll get the opportunity to meet face to face over the course of the coming year. Meantime, I do hope you feel part of the team, at least virtually. Sorry, I moved on a bit too fast there. Let me get back. So as part of the delivery of today's event, the team at QAA Scotland have worked with colleagues from across the sector who would have been delivering sessions at the face-to-face conference. And they've developed a suite of asynchronous resources, which I think you've been guided to in the chat line, but I know there'll be an opportunity for you to look at those online resources, not just during the conference, but once the conference is finished. We'll also be highlighting key resources that are available through the Enhancement theme website. Those resources, as I've said, have been developed over the last 3 years of work. So I'd like to finish off by wishing you again a very warm welcome to everybody who's joining us today and tomorrow. And I'll finish by introducing our keynote speaker for today. This is Professor Mary Stuart, who's the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Lincoln. Professor Stuart is a graduate of the University of Cape Town in South Africa and of the Open University, where she obtained her doctorate in social policy. Her research interests are focused on social mobility and higher education, life histories and civic engagement, and leadership in 21st century organisations. Professor Stuart is passionate about the student experience, and she seeks to continually drive change and improvements in partnership with students, alumni, and with the academic community, promoting the traditional concept of a community of scholars. Professor Stuart was named as The Guardian's most inspiring leader in higher education at their HE Awards in 2018. And she was also awarded a CBE for her services to higher education in the same year. She leads the 21st Century Lab, exploring challenges and opportunities for universities in the 21st century. And it is in this capacity that Mary is speaking to us today. Over the last 3 years, the 21st Century Lab has been exploring with colleagues from around the world the purpose of universities in the 21st century. So this session will explore some of the findings and pose some of the questions for our sector to explore in our changing society. Mary, a very warm virtual welcome to you to Virtual Scotland, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. That's great, Alison. I really appreciate it. And colleagues, hello from my spare bedroom at the top of my Victorian terraced house in Newark, in England. I usually, if I'm doing a keynote speech, I like to walk around. I like to wave my hands all over the place. And I like to really look at participants. As I was trained as an actor originally, I use a lot of body language in order to understand whether what I'm saying is making any sense to people. But it's a little more difficult. It's a little more difficult now to do that. So I hope I hit the mark for you, and I hope you find this session interesting. It is significant that initially when Elsa contacted me about doing a session for you, it was the face-to-face conference, and I wasn't going to be able to get up to Scotland because I've got things I can't change the rest of the day. But because we've moved online, I actually have been able to participate, which says something about the nature of online delivery. And it has been interesting to me how this has enabled quite a bit of reconnection with people across the world, this lockdown situation that we find ourselves in. I've been watching the chat, and I'm delighted to see people from all sorts of places at this conference, and I hope you're really going to enjoy it. So the conference is called Learning from Disruption. And thinking about this, I really like this notion of highlighting disruption. There are absolutely things, listening to Alison, from the enhancement themes that you've been looking at in Scotland, that you can learn from in the context of this disruption. And I hope some of the things I say will relate to some of the things that you've been finding out in your themes. I kind of want to change that a little bit to not just learning from disruption, but actually I think we need to recognize, and it is one of the things that came out of our 21st century lab work, is that actually, colleagues, we are living with disruption. We are living with disruption because that is the nature of the 21st century. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then there will be a panel discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to engage with you around your comments, your questions through that process. So what I'm hoping to do is, in the context of this talk, to talk a little bit about purpose and values in that changing world that we are living in, to explain to you a bit about the 21st Century Lab and what we've been doing there, and then of course there's questions and comments in that context. So I hope that'll hit the mark in terms of where we're going. So why did we decide to look at the purpose of universities? You know, why did we take on this idea of exploring the higher education in the 21st century? Well, it seems to me that in different parts of the world, in different ways, there has been too much focus just on the funding of higher education. I'm not saying that funding higher education isn't an important topic for anyone who works in the sector. Of course, it is. But there has been very little guidance in many countries. I think Scotland might be a little bit different in this. I think some of the things that you've been doing in Scotland have been more about purpose than in our part of the world, or indeed in places like Australia. There has been very little guidance around purpose, particularly in the context of a changing world. And you know, it gives me no pleasure at all to say that in the 21st Century Lab, in the work that we did, one of the things we highlighted was health pandemics as being an issue for the 21st century. So there's a whole range of things that are disrupting our lives. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those. And then the response, I think, that universities perhaps need to make in that context. So what is this 21st Century Lab? Well, partly because I wanted to get some debate going around purpose. We set up an initial group of people who were interested in the idea of purpose in changing times. And our first publication, our first piece of work, focused, which was called Thinking Ahead, focused on people who were outside of higher education, not those of us in higher education. And by the way, if you can hear some noises outside, I apologize, but it's dustbin day. So we're having our dustbins collected at the moment. So I apologize if there's any noise coming through. So our first publication, Thinking Ahead, engaged with people from different walks of life, from all over the world, from Australia, the United States, Canada, China, India, the Middle East, Dubai, and also parts of the United Kingdom. So we spoke to them. None of them worked in higher education. We spoke to them about what their perceptions were of the 21st century. And there were a number of themes that came out from those discussions. And by the way, I think you have the details, and these publications are online in the website for the 21st Century Lab, and I think you have the details in your documentation. One of them was the fragility of globalization, and I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted that fragility. A second theme that came out was, of course, the climate emergency. A number of people talked about the dominance of financial capital and how we needed to create greater equality and inclusion in a society that has grown even more unequal than it used to be. And I think the protests that we're currently seeing in America around Black Lives Matter, and quite frankly, the fact that we are needing to do some thinking in our own countries about the inequality between different races and white people and Black people is a sign of how inequality has become really significant, more so than ever in our society. And finally, another theme that came out of that first publication was a lack of trust in, and indeed poor leadership in many countries, not just in any one particular country, but that this is a theme of the 21st century itself. So that was the first phase, to talk to people from around the world who were thinkers. They were in different walks of life. So they might have been policy leaders. They might have worked in the third sector. They might have worked in the arts. They might have worked as entrepreneurs or as technology experts. So coming from very, very different places. Following that work, the next piece of work that we took on, we decided to establish what we called an international higher education reference group. And that reference group took up the challenges that were identified by the people from our first piece of work, and work that into what we call 10 grand challenges for higher education. And the slide that you are now seeing, I must acknowledge, was done by Sigova Savuni, who was one of our illustration graduates at the University of Lincoln. And what she did is she produced an illustration of the 10 grand challenges, highlighting how enormously interconnected these challenges are. So a lot of people at the moment are talking about how we get out of and move beyond the pandemic. To be honest, I think it's going to take us a couple of years, because history tells us that most pandemics do not just go away. There usually are further waves of them, so that we can get to whatever that new normal is. History also tells us that pandemics are often interconnected with things like inequality, with things like unequal shares of wealth, and often create civic dissatisfaction. So even there, you are starting to see things coming together in terms of all of this. And the extent of the speed of the pandemic has a lot to do with our mobility in this global world. We are still, and we don't talk about it a lot, but in several parts of the world, living with significant conflicts and war. I don't actually think in my lifetime, and I'm getting pretty old now, I don't think in my lifetime we have ever not had a war. In Europe at the moment, what we tend to do is export it somewhere else. But tensions in the globe are growing more and more significant. So there are real challenges around that. We are seeing changing identities and changing norms in society, which create challenges between generations, between different groups. And we are seeing changes in economic powers, which is partly where we're starting to see real tensions in different parts of the world. And then, as we all know, we have a major challenge around environmental degradation and ecological damage that we are doing to our planet, which is not just about our generation if we don't tackle that effectively. And one of the things that initially I think people thought with COVID-19 is perhaps that the economic slowdown that was caused, that COVID-19 caused, might have a significant impact on our carbon reduction. In fact, it has only been 17%. So we still have a major challenge there, and we cannot forget that. So the HE reference group set out these 10 grand challenges for higher education in the 21st century. And as a result of that, we looked to what we felt universities should be doing in a crisis-driven world. So for me, I don't think it's being overly dramatic to call this a crisis-driven world. I think from the slide that is in front of you, you can see the range of things which relate to those 10 grand challenges that I think we are living with. And what we are seeking to do, what came out of that higher education reference group, was the idea of using a kind of a lens of what we call permeability. So ensuring that the purpose of universities went beyond just what we do in teaching and research, because we've always done that, but our response should be much more engagement, and indeed a fluidity between ourselves and our communities. And there are many communities that we work with in higher education. First and foremost is our own community, the community of scholars. As Alison said, I have championed the notion of community of scholars between all our staff and all our students, to look again at how we do things together And I think Scotland's work around enhancement with the QAA is a good example of much more of a collaborative approach. But I guess with permeability, it becomes an ongoing, almost intertwined way of working. Beyond that, we have many other communities that we work with. Universities have not been loved in their communities in many places for quite some time. They've been seen as elitist, standoffish. Students are often seen as a problem. And we really need, if we are going to create societies that are coherent and feel that they have a purpose together, we really need universities and their communities to feel that they are at one. So what is education and research that is permeable? Well, for me, it's a much more engaged way of developing our curriculum. For a very long time, and of course, as academics, we have studied hard, we have learnt, we have researched, and we have a lot to bring to the table in terms of the offering of knowledge for our students and our communities. However, we cannot and do not understand everyone else's perspective. We have lived our lives. And if we are going to communicate effectively, we have to be much more open to learning from our students and from our communities. And therefore, our curriculum has to change. A clear example of that is the decolonization of the curriculum. But there are many others that I think we need to be thinking about in terms of how we change what we teach, not just how we teach. Equally, it has become more significant in recent years that our research has better governance, has more involvement of our communities, but there is a lot more to do in terms of oversight of the research we do and accountability for the public money that we spend in terms of the research that we are doing. We need to think much more and listen much better and respond and act for our communities. So now I thought I would end by talking about some of, I think, the challenges that as we are living with disruption and how we need to learn from disruption, that I think we can begin to explore a little bit in this session, but I'm sure you'll be thinking about throughout the conference. And these are definitely the questions that we are posing and exploring in the next phase of the 21st Century Lab. How do we prepare our students for uncertainty and risky futures? It's quite clear, you know, we have no idea quite what the next academic year is going to be like in terms of how we will be teaching, how long we'll be teaching in one way and whether we have to change to another way. There's a huge amount of uncertainty. For those students who are going out into the world of employment at the end of this academic year, whenever your academic year ends, depending on what part of the world you're in, there will be a very risky future. We know that unemployment has already been hit, so there are very significant issues. And, you know, if it isn't a pandemic, it will be something else, or it will be a pandemic and something else. So our futures are very risky. How we prepare our students indeed to live in that world is really an important question for us. being in higher education where we value truly thoughtful knowledge, how do we deal with the speeds of communication that we are now living with, the range of information that's out there, and indeed fake news? How do we enable our students to equally value truly thoughtful knowledge? And how do we counter those other forms of knowledge? It's not enough. And this is exactly where I think we are being impenetrable. It's not enough to just say, it's fake news, forget it. We have to have a way of demonstrating the love that we have for truly thoughtful knowledge so that others can develop that love as well. I think we have woken up to the reality of the pandemic and the climate emergency. But you know, we are doing all sorts of planning around those things that we know about. What about the things that come left field? How do we prepare for other equally knotty issues? And how can we, in the context of the theme of this conference, learn from this disruption to enable us to live with other disruptions? And how do universities support this? Because if universities are not at the heart of this work, we're not doing our job properly. And I feel very strongly about values. I think fundamentally, the real question that we have to answer is how do we work with our students to create a better world than the one we've got right now? So thank you very much. I hope you found that interesting, and I look forward to the discussion now.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary, for that fascinating and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you. Could I also ask Alison Tobin, please, to unmute and to open up your video or restart your video so that we can engage both of you in the questions that are coming. We now have for delegates up to 12:10 for some questions and discussions, just so that you know what to expect. And I'm really pleased to see that we have a number of questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to start from the top for those that have been upvoted in that Q&A box. So starting with that first one, this is from one of our delegates, Pam, who asks, socioeconomic issues are factors in how we can respond to global pandemics or disruption. And her question is, how do we ensure that all students are still able to continue to engage during these times? And can I turn first to Mary? How can we ensure that all students are able to keep engaging?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I think so many of us through the last few weeks have been grappling with that in different ways. I mean, I've got a few thoughts, but I'm sure there are other people who've got thoughts in terms of that, and I hope they can put some things in the chat in terms of their experiences and things that they've worked on. So for me, some of the things is to try and imagine some of the challenges that students might have. So the first thing is how you can be proactive in terms of that. So initially, we thought quite clearly that some students would not have access to computers, would not have good facilities wherever they were to be able to study very effectively. So we provided grants so that our students could buy computers if they needed to. We had a loan scheme, and while we could, we created safe spaces for students to be able to study. That is a bigger challenge, but in fact, through this 11-week period of lockdown, as soon as students were able to, we actually found we ended up with more students on campus, and we enabled students to come back as soon as that was allowed, because they were struggling at home. Wherever that home was. So actually we now have more students on campus than we had at the start of lockdown. So that's the proactive phase. The other is the engagement phase. So you can't imagine everything, you don't know everybody's circumstances. So you really need a good communication channel between your students and the university. And when I say the university, it needs to be different ways, because students will come in through different places. Some will go to their tutors. Some won't want to go to their tutors because they feel embarrassed that they haven't been studying or whatever. So they might go to student support, or they might go to the student union. And you need all those channels to be working together so that you can provide that responsive support at that particular time. And sometimes that means being flexible. It might mean phoning students to provide a bit of support because the online stuff isn't working for them, and so on. So those are just a few ideas.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much, Mary. Alison, I'm conscious that I want to bring you in about opportunities to engage students either during the current disruption or at other points of disruption. And I'm perhaps bringing in some of the particular Scottish dimension. I'm conscious we have, for example, student partnership agreements and devices like that, which are supported by our national body Sparks to help us engage with students. But I'm interested to hear from you, Alison.
Yes, I mean, in some ways it's become easier to engage with, not just with students, but with colleagues, because we know where everybody is at the moment. So this virtual world means that you can actually get hold of people relatively easily. In terms of engaging with students, again, we've all done similar things to Mary, I'm sure, with providing access to equipment, and that's been needed for staff as well as for students. So we've had some quite imaginative methods of delivering equipment to colleagues. My own location in rural Fife is a little bit slow in broadband, so I had a piece of equipment through the post from my IT department that speeded up my connection. Otherwise you really wouldn't have heard me today in my presentation. So it's not just equipment, it's a sort of geographic location, and parts of the UK are not really as good as they should be for accessing the internet. We kept our exams open for 7 days at Napier with that in mind, not just because of the timescale differences, but also the internet access that could be quite challenging, particularly when lots and lots of students are trying to submit the work at the same time. In terms of engaging with students for the next academic year, we're certainly looking to be much more actively engaged through the personal tutors process, through student representation and through staff-student liaison committees. And I have heard from some students commenting on those student-staff interactions, again, quite positively, that they feel more comfortable in this virtual environment rather than being sitting in a room with some fairly intimidating, not including me, of course, some fairly intimidating professors. So that environment can be a little bit more relaxed for some students than that would encourage them to speak up more. So I'm sort of dwelling on some positives here, despite all the challenges that we've all been trying to meet.
Yeah, well, I think that's incredibly important, isn't it? To look at what it is, what are the steps we can take to address the current challenges. I can see that we've got a number of questions that are being upvoted, but I'd like to stick with the question of students and engaging students. We have a question here from one of our students who's very engaged with us, Kate Dewberry from SRUC. So hi Kate, thanks for joining us. And Kate has a question picking up on Mary's point about decolonising the curriculum. And Dubai Kate Dubai asks, are there other changes that we could be making to the curriculum, such as queering the curriculum, including knowledge and text from LGBTQ+ communities and authors? And she's interested in how this work is progressing at your university and whether it's being led by students or on the university's initiative. Mary, is that something that as part of the permeability of changes in the curriculum you've been looking at Lincoln?
It absolutely is, and just on who's leading it, I feel quite strongly that these things should never be led by either students or staff. You know, that's the purpose of a community of scholars. It is always a partnership. And students will bring one set of knowledges to the table, and staff will bring another set of knowledges, and sometimes they will have shared knowledges. That work has started, like the decolonizing the curriculum. It's still, quite frankly, in its infancy. There's so much to do. There's so much that colleagues need to understand. There are so many prejudices that we need to get out on the table and help each other address those and learn from each other to create a more inclusive community. I don't in any way, shape or form believe that we have got anywhere near right in any of these yet. But the good thing from my perspective is that our staff and our students want to engage with these debates. That's you know important, but it is a big project, because it's not just about changing the curriculum, it's about changing mindsets, and unless you can change the mindset, you won't get to the place you need to for the curriculum.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to turn to Alison as well. I mean, we know that the current pandemic has prompted a lot of focus on how we're delivering our curriculum, but Alison, do you think this opens up an opportunity for us to think about the content of the curriculum in the kinds of ways that Katie Dubai was asking?
I think it does, and I think engaging with students, that co-development, that collaboration, students as colleagues, that's a project that we've led on quite extensively at Napier, and we'll be building on it again to get that feedback from students on how we're doing in terms of our new approaches to learning and teaching as we increasingly go over to remote learning and teaching for the time being. So yes, that partnership working is really, really important, and I would expect, as the new enhancement theme comes in, that we'll be engaging students in that co-development of the curriculum. So it's not just about content, it's about style. I think it's about flexibility. As you know, when we were having those early discussions about the next enhancement theme, we of course then didn't realise what was about to hit us, but we were already considering that the way in which we engage with students is going to be a lot more flexible, because students are not just the stereotype 18-year-old school leaver that lives on campus and devotes all their waking hours to studying. That clearly is not the model that we should be working to anymore. There's very much a mixed model, and students come with lots and lots of different experiences and different backgrounds, and we need to work with that and collaborate with them on it.
That's great, thank you. Yes, and we certainly in the community of Scottish higher education institutions look forward to doing that with our next enhancement theme on creating effective learning communities. I'm going to, it's a slight change of tack. It's a question that's been posed by Deborah McFarlane and upvoted a number of times. How do university leaders decide which of the challenges to prioritise? That's a nice and easy question, Mary. I'm sure that didn't take long to resolve.
It is a really good question. So when I was a young academic, I was very fortunate to have a terrific mentor who taught me something about writing lists. And I've always been a list person. I like writing lists, but the thing he taught me was that all the things that you set out that you think you need to get done are priorities. You then need to look again at what is urgent versus what is important. And in terms of prioritizing which issues to focus on, one of the biggest challenges I think we have in the 21st century, it's not an either-or century, it's an and century. And this is partly what I was trying to say earlier. Things are interconnected, they're not separate. And actually it's very difficult to separate out and say we're going to just focus on this for the moment. Although to some extent you have to do that. And that's where I think this idea of some things being urgent, i.e. they just have to be dealt with. You know, you've got an immediate crisis, you've got a student in distress stood in front of you, that has to be dealt with. That is absolutely urgent and important, and everything else has to go by the wayside until that's dealt with. But then there might be bigger things which are kind of long-term things, and you can't say I'm not going to deal with that. You have to deal with it. For example, if you take the climate emergency, it's an emergency now because of the future. So that's a long-term thing. So we've got to do it now, but it's not going to create a problem necessarily for us by the end of today. So actually being able to tee those two things apart sometimes helps.
Thanks, Mary. I'm going to just stick with you for the moment and ask a question that was early into our Q&A box from Diane Grayson, who's in South Africa. Hello, Diane, you've been a visitor and a long-term friend to the enhancement theme, so I'm glad you can join us. Diane is asking, how did you choose, Mary, which countries to involve in the 21st Century Lab as part of that study?
There wasn't, some of it was serendipitous. So it was someone who knew someone else in terms of that, you know, in sociological terms, we call that snowball technique. It's just a posh word for you know, moving things along through a chain. I have to say, I really wanted to make sure that we had voices from not the usual suspects. So if I had a filter, it was probably that. If you have a look at the first publication, Thinking Ahead, you will see these are all leaders in their fields, but you will see that they are coming from quite different backgrounds and have had quite different experiences. So we put a bit of a filter around that. In terms of the HE reference group, in terms of the countries that were chosen, they were countries where there have been interesting discussions about higher education in recent times. So there's been debate about the nature of higher education in South Africa, Australia, the US, and the four nations of the UK quite a bit. So those were kind of natural to choose because people were already kind of sensitized to some of those matters. I have to say there are gaps, significant gaps in that. We had some input from colleagues in India, but not enough. And in terms of places like Singapore and Malaysia, there was no engagement at all. So it's not comprehensive in any shape or form, and we are not. We wouldn't seek to say we were comprehensive.
Thank you. Yes, I think sometimes the happenstantial is very useful, is a useful technique. Excuse me, but I liked your snowball link theory. But thank you for that. Moving back to the top of our question and answer box, it's a question from Pam, and she's picking up on your comment about permeability from the 21st Century Lab. She is asking, how do we help universities and their communities feel more as one? Sorry, I was a bit husky there. I hope you heard that question.
Yes, thank you, Elsa. I did. Yes, well, there is no fixed answer to this because it's about ongoing connection. And there is no easy answer to this because it is long-term. It is it's a significant commitment to community. The values-driven approach has to be that you believe in the community, the communities that you're located in. So we're starting from a concept of our communities and place. There are then the communities of interest that you need to engage with, which might go beyond place. It is long-term. It's a deep commitment from the whole of the university community. And it's an understanding that your communities, if they are not holding their university, that university will not be successful. It will be an isolated, well, you know, obviously in some league tables, those sorts of universities can be successful. But my argument is in the 21st century that we need our universities deeply engaged with communities, because that separation that we created is the same as the kind of separation that we created with our leaders separate from their communities. And it didn't go down well for us as we started the 21st century, and it isn't going down well right now.
Thank you, Mary. It's a powerful message for us. Alison, I'd like to bring you in here on this. So the question was about how we help universities and their communities feel more as one. I'm interested in your contribution on this, either from your current institution or from other places you've worked. I'm conscious that there's often, and particularly at your own university at the moment, Edinburgh Napier, you have a substantial volunteer programme, for example, but I don't know if you want to talk about that or other aspects of community engagement.
I think it's probably beyond that. It's actually demystifying universities and getting out into the community. So I've done quite a lot over the years to encourage particularly students to go out into the community. I set up an undergraduate ambassador scheme when I was at St Andrews that I'm pleased to see is still thriving more than 10 years on now. And that has sent students out from initially just from biology, but it's now spread across the entire university, from the sciences through to arts and divinity. And those students go out on placements in local schools. And that's been an incredibly satisfying project to see grow over the years, where we've had science students going into primary schools and teaching them about the Big Bang Theory, for example. That particular student got in the week before the vicar arrived, the minister arrived from church, and when he was talking to the children about the start of the world, their hands all shut up and said it was the Big Bang, which was very pleasing to the physics student. So that's one level of engagement, but I think also it's reaching out into communities that wouldn't normally reach in. So again, I've seen students now doing demonstrations in shopping centres with creatures and microscopes and things that children can engage in. So it's that demystification, I think, and particularly for me as a scientist, I've seen that as a challenge to take that out to people who are perhaps a little bit nervous about coming in and trying things. So yes, student volunteering, of course, get people out, get students out so that people can learn from students. But I think we as academics need to cast off that sort of frosty professorial appearance and be more accommodating.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and Alison and Mary, I think two less frosty professors we could hardly have chosen, so thank you very much for that. But yes, that's right, I'm interested in that sense of using the full scope of education and reaching into other sectors. You mentioned the primary school link there, which can be so powerful, can't it, in all kinds of ways. I'm going to turn to another question, this one from Fiona Godsman, and hi Fiona, and another colleague from within Scotland, although working with entrepreneurial activity with us. And Fiona's asking, do you think the UN Sustainable Development Goals should be introduced to students as part of their studies? Mary, was that something that you had looked at as part of the 21st Century Lab?
Yes, absolutely, and it's referenced quite a lot within our work. I think and in fact that set of proposals came from our colleagues in South Africa and Australia. They are far more ahead of this than we are in the UK in that regard. So we have learnt quite a bit from those universities in terms of things that they've been doing in that regard. It seems to me that those UN development goals are incredibly useful for opening up debate across the arts and the sciences. There's some really interesting work you can do within the sciences with the sustainability goals there. So it's actually a really helpful way of developing our curriculum, and also bringing in a much more internationalized way of seeing what we do. So yes, I think it's a brilliant tool.
Thank you. And Alison, is this something you've been looking at as part of Edinburgh Napier's activity?
We're starting to look at it. We're working on our new strategy now beyond 2020, and the Sustainable Development Goals are definitely going to be in there, not just in terms of teaching and learning, but the way that the university functions as well. I think to introduce students to it, I'd probably turn that around and say that the students will be introducing us to it as well. I think that's the way to drive change, is that students are now coming with the enthusiasm and the vision that perhaps our generation appears to lack. So I would see that they would be driving a lot of this activity with their own engagement in world affairs, and that's the way that, rather than us stand up in front of a class of students and induct them into this, I think again there's a great opportunity here for this co-creation.
Thanks, Alison. I'm going to turn to a question that's sometimes uncomfortable within higher education, although actually I think we should all be much more comfortable with it, and that's touching the topic of failure, which is something that interests me, and we can all look up who it was who said we should learn to fail, we should fail better, and enjoy that. This is a question from Tina Harrison, who's asking how we shift teaching and assessment to enable students to have a go and fail. And how can we encourage those students to learn from failure without failing them? How do we build resilience in our students and create the conditions for innovation, or innovative and creative thought? Mary, is learning from failure, is that something that's part of Lincoln activity?
Well, it's certainly part of my life. I mean, I did one course which I failed, and it scarred me for a number of years, quite frankly. It set me back, and then when I came back to study later, what I discovered was that as I started to engage with learning again, I was able to deal with learning much better because I'd made mistakes. And that has been a really important lesson, which comes, you know, from deep inside me, that I've used in all my teaching over the years. Not necessarily to talk about my own experience, but when students don't do well or you know, flunk out in some kind of serious way, it is exactly at that moment that you want to go back to them and say, just give yourself a bit of time, because there's no point in actually trying to talk to them at that particular moment. Give yourself a bit of time, but come back to me, because we can find a way that you can pull out what went wrong, and you can turn that into helping you do better next time. But it is really important to give them some space, because it whatever one says, when you have done some work or whatever, and it comes back as a fail, it feels personal. You can't overcome that. And actually, I think we've got to face that. So we need to give people time to recover, but you need to give them the hope at that moment. You're feeling rubbish now, but you need to come back, because we can get this, we can turn this around. That's the kind of key thing. And I think, you know, we have too much of a view of failure as not being something that you learn from in this country. In the world of work, people are making mistakes all the time. I constantly am still making mistakes. You know, you can't get everything right. But the best thing is you reach a stage, you have learned so much that you know it's okay to say, I'm not going to get everything right, I do this wrong. But you need to sit alongside the student and get them through that down period.
Do you think that up to the or before the point of a student feeling that they have failed, is there a way in which we can design teaching, learning, and in particular assessment to actually encourage students to experiment in that creative space and to try things that so that they feel that they're not necessarily going to fail ultimately, but that they can experiment and have a go?
Well, I think experimentation actually, things not working out because of an experiment is not that failure moment. And actually we perhaps need to separate those two things out. Experimentation seems to me to be part of well-designed teaching. And you know, we know in research that we endlessly are designing things, developing hypotheses, all the rest of it, that don't necessarily work, and that's fine. So fundamentally, we need to take that piece of learning and make sure that that's part of the teaching. Good, well-designed teaching always has experimentation. You need to say up front, some of your experiments, some of the things you're going to try just aren't going to work, but you know, you will learn from that, and that's fine. And actually, that's you doing the right thing.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And perhaps getting back to that essential notion of an essay as an attempt rather than something that's always beautifully polished. Alison, I'm going to turn over, I guess as a biologist, you're no stranger to experimentation. Would you like to comment on how we might shift teaching and assessment to encourage this kind of innovative and creative thought?
Well, certainly research teaches you that you learn so much more from the failed experiment than the one that works, more often than not. I wonder whether what we're talking about here, though, is confidence, instilling confidence in students so that they can try things out and then reflect on what went well and what didn't go so well. So it's rather than a you've passed or you've failed, it's actually a what have you learned from doing this. And I'm seeing a lot in the chats about formative assessments. And also a reminder, one of my colleagues at Napier, Fiona Smart, is running a project on learning from failure. So I don't know whether Fiona's online at the moment, but certainly she could post some links to resources that she's developing from that project. The other aspect of this question, though, and it's worth considering this and sharing this. I was in a discussion recently with a deputy head teacher from a secondary school in England, and he was advising universities to really consider new students arriving in September, October with us, many of whom have not completed their final assessments. They're leaving school with estimated A levels and higher. And some of them may be feeling that they've earned them without really working at them. So there could be a certain lack of confidence that they would otherwise have gained by having that, that real certificate to show what their grades are. And I think we could help them a lot by engaging with them at an early stage, working with them on formative assessments and giving them some very early reassuring feedback that they're on the right line. So building confidence, I would say, is the way to equip people with failure. And then, just as Mary's done, I'd admit that we've all failed at some stage and actually do on a daily basis. I'm reflecting on a meeting I was in yesterday and immediately afterwards thought I could have done a lot better in that.
Yes, it's that reflection and identifying the learning from that experience. I'm going to just take one last question before wrapping up. And this one comes from Jill Mackay, who says, thanks for the talk, really interesting. So thank you. I'm going to pass that on to you because that's coming up lots of times here, not only as I'm being the conduit for that, thanks. What Jill's question is, she's saying, when I've been involved in curriculum design processes, I often find colleagues view question and answer or Q&A as a barrier to innovation, feeling they can't do something the way they want. And she's asking, do you have any advice for supporting colleagues to engage positives with Q&A? Mary?
I'm surprised by that, really, and because and maybe it goes back to what Alison was saying about confidence. Actually, maybe it's to do with our colleagues' confidence in this, because you don't quite know what's going to come up in Q&A environments, and it's not something that's controllable. I think we need to help our colleagues to be more confident. One of the things that I found over the years in terms of the partnership approach that I've always taken with students is that it fundamentally, to enable it to work, the staff need to, your colleagues, your academic colleagues, need to have sufficient confidence to feel they can engage properly, because it can be quite nerve-wracking not knowing how something's going to go, because you're giving up control, and Q&A is often about giving up control. So I think it is about confidence, and sometimes we need to acknowledge ourselves that we can not be confident as well as students. We're all human beings. So I guess I would work on that more, and I would also perhaps point to how you can use it as a way of helping guide students to them feeling like they've worked through the understanding for themselves, rather than it being set out to them. That process of engagement between question and answer has been a way of it almost coming from the inside, that knowledge. That's where I think it's really quite powerful.
Yeah, thank you. Conscious of time, Alison, do you have any final thoughts either in that question or others?
I think Jill was asking about quality assurance processes. I think that's what she intended to ask about, and the feeling that some colleagues have that quality assurance is something that they have to get through in order to get on with what they really want to be doing. And I think the way to, I'm conscious I'm speaking in front of the QAA here, but I think the way to engage colleagues in the quality assurance process is actually as a collaborative process, so that instead of waiting until they come with their newly designed programs and then to be told what's wrong with them, we actually work with them on the process and see it as a constructive approach to developing a new curriculum. Because if you're a teacher, what better opportunity is there to to develop your discipline for the next few years, and bring your approach to the way that you want to direct that discipline within your university. I mean, there should be a real pride in that, rather than a, gosh, we've got to pass quality assurance. So that would be my approach. And I'm conscious I have colleagues here listening in who have been at the receiving end of this.
They're going to hold you to that now. I guess that and thank you for picking up on the quality assurance rather than Q&A. I was very literal in my interpretation of the question. Apologies to me in that. So thank you for picking that up from the chat function. And I guess it's one of the reasons why in the Scottish sector we shifted the discussion so that we were focusing on enhancement, which is built on that foundation of partnership, so that we're moving away from a sense of retrospective checking and more on that forward-facing enhancement and collaboration and working together to make things as good as they can be. So thank you. I think that's a really nice note to round up on. I would just like to thank you, Alison, very much indeed for your introduction and your engagement. And Mary, thank you so much for that fantastic keynote presentation. Thank you for allowing us to share the resources from the 21st Century Lab, and thank you for engaging in our Q&A, and this time I do mean that, question and answer session here. Thank you so much indeed. Thank you for your time, and thanks to delegates for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to engage with us.